reach a wider audience. Today we're joined by Dr. Evan Wilson, an associate professor in the Hattendorf Historical Center at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. A recipient of the Sir Julian Corbett Prize in Modern Naval History, he researches the naval history of Britain and other countries from the 18th to 20th century. He's an author or editor of 6 books, most recently, The Horrible Peace, British Veterans and the End of the Napoleonic Wars, published in 2023. Before coming to Newport, he was the Cairns Senior Research Fellow at the National Maritime Museum in the UK, and Associate Director of International Security Studies at Yale. He holds degrees from Yale, Cambridge, and Oxford. Without further ado, Dr. Wilson.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks so much to Stan for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Hope the tech works. We'll find out. Okay. Oop, don't do that. There we go. When I was a young graduate student at Cambridge, I spent a term working as Paul Kennedy's research assistant. Paul had been given a term off teaching from Yale and also given a carriage house just outside the city. It's nice to be Paul. I would bicycle out to the house to deliver library books to him and to talk about his work. Occasionally, he would host small gatherings, though they were never really planned. One evening, he decided at the last minute to host a Burns Night party, which you may or may not know is held on or about January 25th, the birthday of the 18th century Scottish poet Robert Burns. At a Burns Night party, there are lots of traditions that aren't important here. The key point is that you drink a lot of scotch and you read a lot of poems, and as you drink scotch and read poems, you develop a thick Scottish accent and an unfortunate interest in reading some of Burns's more sexually suggestive poems, of which there are many. Well, this night in January, I had invited a friend to Paul's house, but Paul had neglected to invite more than 1 or 2 others, with the result that my friend, Paul, and one other former student of his sat around Paul's living room drinking and reading incomprehensible poetry. So it was a pretty lame Burns night, but that didn't stop Paul. Now, I should state here before I go on that my friend was soon to become my girlfriend, but was not yet my girlfriend. And I should mention that the other student who was there was a man, so there was a real gender imbalance, and there was a lot of awkwardness because, of course, I was involved. But that's what the scotch was for, right? So we started drinking and reading, and Paul, bless him, was not the most attentive master of ceremonies. As he passed around a little book of Burns's poetry for us to read from, he forgot which poems were dirty and which were not. And so soon enough, my poor friend had to read some poem about what the wife gets up to when with the stable hand when the husband's gone. She powered through it, and nothing untoward happened, and no lines were crossed, but I felt really bad for her. And given the power dynamic that I had at that time with Paul, I was too much of a coward to call him out on it. Now, my story has a happy ending. My friend became my girlfriend, and she's now my wife. But I remembered that story when I was working on this book with Paul, because we read one of Burns's most famous poems that night in addition to the sexy ones. We read To a Mouse, which contains the famous line, "The best laid plans of mice and men oft go awry." And I thought that was a perfect encapsulation of the project. So I pitched Best Laid Plans to Paul as a title for the book without mentioning the whole Burns Night thing. It was my far too subtle way of getting back at him. And he agreed, so we pitched it to Naval Institute. Now, Naval Institute put Best Laid Plans into Amazon, and all the hits that came back were romance novels. So they shot it down. So here we are. Instead, I'm talking about a book with a much more generic title, Planning for War at Sea, 400 Years of Great Power Competition. It comes out with Naval Institute, as the flyer I hope you have says, on February 5th. It's based on a conference that Paul and I organized at Yale in 2022. But I think that my original title does get at a central theme of the book, which is that Navy's best laid plans rarely work out the way they'd hoped. So specifically, Paul and I asked the contributors to think about 3 questions. How have navies contemplated possible enemies? How did they learn or fail to learn once operations began? And how does this analysis inform today's planning for future conflict? So my plan today is to talk in general terms about the themes and the table of contents, and then I'll give you a decent amount of detail on my chapter. Since I edited the book, I'm happy to answer questions on any of the chapters, but of course I can't give you the kinds of details that an author would give you. You'll have to buy the book if that's what you're here for. I have 2 disclaimers before I get started. First, I was trained as a normal civilian academic, which means that I developed a healthy skepticism of the practical usefulness of history. Somehow I've managed to maintain that skepticism, but despite knowing Paul for almost 20 years, and despite working in professional military education, or PME, for the last 7 years. Now, as I'm sure you know, part of working with Paul and part of working in PME is learning to speak the language of practitioners, from Paul's good buddy Henry Kissinger all the way down to a newly promoted 04 in my class, or indeed to your midshipman. And I think the questions that you see on the screen and the remainder of this talk will demonstrate how I have been infected by what I like to call PME brain, which is a mind virus that tends to force all historical inquiry to address present-day concerns. In my defense, Paul has suffered from what is effectively PME brain for his whole life, so much so that he even tries to predict the future with famous results. I probably didn't stand a chance of avoiding infection given my relationship to him. I will say, though, that I've come to appreciate aspects of PME brain. There's an honesty about PME brain that those who are not infected, which might do well to investigate, namely that all historical inquiry is shaped by the conditions and the concerns of the present. And I think it's healthy to ask ourselves as historians as we conduct research projects, so what? Why do we care about this? Nevertheless, some of the questions I'm about to ask, and indeed the questions that are on the screen, really only make sense if you understand the mission of history to be fundamentally practical. And I'm aware that this is a minority understanding in the field. I just want to state at the beginning that I acknowledge that, and please understand that I approach that understanding from a place of, as I said, skepticism. My second disclaimer is simpler. The views and opinions I express today are my own, and not necessarily those of the U.S. Naval War College, Department of the Navy, or the U.S. government. Okay, enough throat clearing. The table of contents. Not every chapter answers all 3 questions, but each one tackles at least a part of our research agenda. So we start with an examination of the First Anglo-Dutch War in the 1650s, and then we jump ahead to the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic period. Your very own Abby Mullen, present here in row 2, thank you, wrote a great chapter on the complicated politics of the Barbary Coast and how the US Navy had to be prepared to fight all or none of the powers in that region with very confusing effects. Abby's chapter makes the point that the US Navy in 1801 didn't know which enemies to prepare for, and everything else about American operations in the Med follows from that starting point. So then we leap ahead to 2 chapters on the First World War, followed by 2 chapters on the interwar period. I'll call your attention to Ryan Wadley's chapter on the interwar period, which takes a completely different approach from Abby. He points out that in the 1930s, US naval leaders knew exactly what they were preparing for, fighting Japan in the Pacific. But that meant that they prioritized planning for war with Japan at the expense of planning for war with planning to fight other enemies in other theaters, like the Germans in the North Atlantic. They were very good at anticipating some parts of the war to come, but they had sizable blind spots as well. After Ryan comes 3 chapters on the French, the Japanese, and the British in the Second World War. And then I want to call your attention to Ryan Peakes' chapter there, chapter 11, the Maritime Strategy's Missing Middle. He describes the maritime strategy of the 1980s as a deliberate attempt to move on from Vietnam and reconfigure the US Navy for an offensive global war with the Soviet Union. But that came at the expense of preparing to fight minor powers. And in turn, the missing middle, is what he called it, muddled US naval planning after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then I'll call your attention to these 3 chapters on the Russian, the Chinese, and the US navies in the post-Cold War world. And I think there's probably something in here for everyone. Again, I'm happy to talk about these as best I can, but these are not the chapters that I wrote. What I like to talk about now, as a way of illustrating how a specific historical case study speaks to the broader themes, is a chapter that I wrote. As a reminder, here are 3 questions again. How have navies contemplated possible enemies? How did they learn or fail to learn? And how does this analysis inform today's planning? So my chapter tried to talk about all 3 questions. It's about 2 navies that couldn't stop thinking about each other. From 1744 until 1815, Britain and France were at war for nearly 6 years out of every 10, what one historian has called the 70 Years' War. When they weren't at war with each other, they were busy thinking about how to recover what they'd lost or defend what they'd won, so that when war resumed, as everyone expected it to, they would be ready to fight again. So my chapter drills down onto the 1780s to look at one episode in the Anglo-French rivalry. For the sake of time, I have to skip over this chart of the Anglo-French-Spanish naval arms race of the 1780s. The bottom line, though, is that the British economy boomed in the 1780s, growing at about 6% a year, which allowed the 24-year-old Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, to manage the national debt, invest in naval infrastructure, and complete the shipbuilding that had been started during the war. And it wasn't just that the fundamentals were strong either. Pitt's ministers were able to plan well in advance for the war that they knew was coming. So even if they were a little bit surprised by the actual start of the war, they had good ideas, long thought through, about what they were going to do when it did. Now, in the event, it all went wrong, and that's where I try to touch on the book's themes. I'm interested in the question of why a Navy that had thought about its enemy in advance for decades and invested in its own strength to prepare to fight that enemy should so badly mismanage the first few years of the war. And I think you can see in that question some areas that might be of interest to practitioners today. So for all that the French Revolution heralded a new era in world history, Britain went to war in February 1793 for a deeply traditional reason. Britain could not allow a major power to control the Low Countries. Thus, the French invasion of the Austrian Netherlands in September 1792, following a victory over Prussian forces at Valmy, was what set Britain on the path to war. You'll recall that it's difficult to invade Britain from the French coast of the English Channel as the prevailing winds blow from the west, and there aren't very many good ports on the French side of the Channel. So it's much easier to invade Britain from the Low Countries. So French revolutionary armies massed there were possibly an existential threat. Another deeply traditional reason that Britain went to war was to refight the last war. Pitt's investments in the 1780s, combined with the obvious chaos in France, seemed to offer the perfect opportunity for Britain to reverse the mistakes of the American Revolutionary War, not by retaking the former colonies, but instead by destroying French sea power. After all, an army in the Netherlands was destined to remain in the Netherlands if it didn't have a fleet to carry it to Britain. In the meantime, Britain could rely on the Prussians to keep the French army sufficiently occupied. Thus, at the beginning of the war in 1793, the two major war aims blended together to generate British strategy. Respond to the threat in the Low Countries by tackling French sea power first, but without making the mistakes of the American War. So what were the mistakes of the American War? Well, Pitt had already corrected one, which was making sure that the fleet was ready for war. This time, Britain had continental allies as well. So far, so good. The other major mistake had been to let the French Navy escape European waters and carry the war to North America. So the three men responsible for directing the war effort were Pitt, the big picture, Lord Grenville, the Foreign Secretary, on the bottom, and Henry Dundas, the Home Secretary, on the top. They recognized this, and they organized British forces to prioritize Europe first. They decided to return British strategy to what it had been in the 7 Years' War when Pitt's father had been Prime Minister. Concentrate British forces in European waters with the goal of keeping the French also in European waters. If that could be done with less than all of Britain's available forces, the remainder would then be free to operate in the empire to capture French colonies. So doing so would, it was assumed, bring France to the negotiating table as it had done in all previous 18th century wars. So with that in mind, British deployments in 1793 emphasized protecting the western approaches to the English Channel and watching the French fleet at Toulon. These two fleets, the Channel Fleet and the Mediterranean Fleet, accounted for a large percentage of the available forces, but not all. There are about half a dozen ships of the line and possibly as many as 13,000 troops available to be launched at some suitable target. This is what Julian Corbett later called the disposal force, which I think is a really unfortunate name, especially if you are in the disposal force. But nevertheless, the question facing Henry Dundas was where to send the disposal force. Dundas's answer was, again, deeply traditional, the West Indies. It was widely assumed that France's economy depended on overseas trade, in particular from the West Indies. That region generated 2/5 of France's foreign trade and 2/3 of its deep sea shipping. Furthermore, the islands in the region were easy to isolate with naval power and weakly defended. They generated immense profits from sugar and coffee while consuming the lives of enslaved people, but of course all the British cared about were the profits. Capturing French islands would strengthen British positions at the negotiating table when this war, like all previous wars, inevitably caused financial crises in the major combatants and petered out. So the West Indies were therefore a suitable target. So that was the situation in February 1793. Britain had a stronger navy, unhampered by revolution. Britain had a competent, experienced leadership team. So Pitt had been in office for 10 years. Britain had a coherent strategy that relied on recent history to help it avoid obvious pitfalls. In short, there was every reason to expect that Britain would be able to destroy what remained of French sea power quickly, take control of valuable colonies, and cruise to an easy victory. Having thought about their enemy in advance for a decade, the British were poised to exploit the enemy's weaknesses and capitalize on their own strengths. But instead, of course, none of that happened. Britain's strategy was wrongly conceived and poorly executed. 5 years later, Britain had still not destroyed French sea power. 8 years later, when the war finally ended, Britain had to concede most of her gains to secure a peace, and that peace lasted less than 2 years before war resumed on a scale previously unknown. The first 2 years of that new war were characterized by a serious invasion threat, and once again, France and her allies had more ships of the line than the British. So what went wrong? Well, Pitt, Grenville, and Dundas failed to understand the ways in which their enemy had changed during the Revolution. Now, I don't want to overstate this because it's always easy as a historian to cherry pick contemporary comments that got it right and ignore comments that got it wrong. But there were several observers who identified the ways in which the Revolution had changed the character of war in Europe. So in August of 1792, the British ambassador at The Hague, Lord Auckland, wrote to his brother that the French troops on the continent were wholly committed to revolutionary ideologies. He said, and I quote, "The French troops, however despicable they may be in point of discipline and command, are earnest in the support of the wicked and calamitous cause in which they are engaged." He said that fighting France now required setting aside the courtesies of the age and aiming for a total disarmament of the population. He even suggested that military executions would be necessary to subdue France. In January 1793, Pitt read a report on the finances of France, which argued that this was a new kind of war, requiring new strategies. France, the anonymous author told Pitt, was simultaneously broke and possessed entirely new capabilities. They said, France has not certain means of making even a first armament, can't even arm a single troop, and yet may possibly bring into action resources of an extent and efficacy unknown in the history of any age or country. So even if such comments were easy to dismiss as overreactions, there was another grander question that British ministers failed to consider, namely, what were France's war aims in 1792 and 1793? If Britain had gone to war with Louis XVI's France in 1787, as had nearly happened, then Pitt might have been able to answer that question quite easily. France's war aims would have been the same as they had been since 1744. The expansion of the French Empire at the expense of the British, combined with aggrandizement or dynastic expansion on the continent. But revolutionary France's war aims were both simpler and more difficult to understand. The survival of the French Republic, which was declared 2 days after the victory at Valmy. Its enemies were both foreign and domestic, and its aspirations were as much ideological as geopolitical. So what Pitt, Grenville, and Dundas were doing in 1793 then was doubly dangerous. Not only were they fighting to recoup losses in the last war, but they were literally fighting the last war. Meanwhile, France was fighting a different kind of war for different reasons. Now that said, British naval strategy in a war against both Bourbon France and a war against revolutionary France might begin from the same sound premise, containing French naval forces in Europe so as to defend the British Isles and the British Empire from invasion. What would be different, though, is the target of the disposal force. Or put another way, what would be different was the ways in which British sea power could influence events on land. And here's where Dundas in particular made mistakes. Because Britain entered the war in February, ministers had time to prepare an expedition for the West Indies. The optimal time for sailing to the West Indies was September, because that meant that you arrived in November after the hurricanes, and then you had about 6 months to campaign before the summer sickly season set in May or June. So the 6 months from the beginning of the war until the expedition's planned departure was a blessing and a curse. It was a blessing because it was always going to take time to assemble 13,000 men and transports and half a dozen ships of the line. It was a curse because it gave Dundas too much time to get distracted. Now, there were very good reasons why Dundas got distracted during the course of 1793. A month after the war began, a major rebellion against the French revolutionary government broke out in the Vendée region. Here was an interesting opportunity for the British because this region was accessible by sea. There were always likely to be challenges to supply the rebels and to coordinate them with them, but through the spring, summer, and fall of 1793, it was reasonable to argue that committing British resources here would do major harm to revolutionary France. And that was what Edmund Burke thought, for example. He argued that the Caribbean was too deadly for invading armies and that any attempt to attack French forces in the Low Countries would be too reliant on Allied armies. In any case, Burke argued that the enemy in this war was not France, but rather Jacobinism, meaning revolutionary ideology. "We're at war with a principle," he wrote in August 1793, "and with an example, which there is no shutting out with fortresses or excluding by territorial limits. No lines or demarcation can bound the Jacobin Empire. It must be extirpated in the place of its origin." So as Burke was writing those words, another opportunity presented itself when royalist rebels in Toulon, site of France's largest naval base in the Mediterranean, took control of the city and offered the French Mediterranean fleet to the blockading British squadron. Perhaps here, a disposal force could be used to take out half of France's naval power in one swoop while simultaneously defending royalists against revolutionaries. So thus, by the time the long envisioned expedition to the West Indies got organized in September and October of 1793, there were at least 3 other theaters in which British forces might have been able to make a difference in France's ideological civil war. The Low Countries, where much of the French army was, the Vendée, where a major rebellion was ongoing, and Toulon, where the chance of grabbing the entire French Mediterranean fleet and destroying a naval base had to be considered. So the cabinet met at Grenville's offices on November 16, 1793 to consider the options. You'll note from that date that the West Indies expedition still hasn't sailed 2 months after it was originally scheduled to leave, for reasons I don't have time to cover. But they compared the possible benefits of the expedition to the West Indies with each of the 3 theaters. They first correctly dismissed concerns that the French would be able to mount an invasion from the Low Countries. So this is George III as John Bull saying what he thinks about the chance of a French invasion. You'll never go to Portsmouth again and think of it the same way, I think is maybe probably there wasn't going to be a French invasion. So it's safe to send the disposal force somewhere. Second, they compared the West Indies with supporting the Vendée and concluded that it would be worth sending some troops to the Vendée at the expense of the West Indies, even if the chances of real success were probably low. Third, they compared the West Indies expedition with Toulon, and Pitt concluded that Toulon might have a better chance of success even than the West Indies. So the result was, inevitably, that British forces were divided into 3. The original strike force for the West Indies was 13,000 men, now is to be just 7,000. The other 6,000 were divided between the Vendée and Toulon. All 3 expeditions failed. Now, that's a little unfair. At Toulon, the besieged forces managed to destroy 9 ships of the line and burn some stores, and in the West Indies, the expedition quickly took Guadeloupe and Martinique. Great. But both were missed opportunities, and the Vendée expedition was a total failure. It wasn't Britain's fault entirely that the Vendée rebellion failed, of course, but you might know that it was brutally suppressed. You can see what's happening in the background there, resulting in the deaths of about 250,000 people. At Toulon, the 13 ships of the line and 5 frigates escaped when revolutionary forces, including a young Napoleon Bonaparte, overran the city. In the West Indies, French reinforcements arrived, declared the abolition of slavery, and in combination with the usual diseases, reversed British gains. So the result was that Britain entered 1794 in the offensive and ended the year retreating on all fronts. Not until 1797 and 1798 did the British Navy begin to turn things around, though as I mentioned, Britain did not enter the peace in 1801 in a strong position. So to summarize then, what went wrong in the first year of the war, and what might be of interest in that analysis to practitioners today? I tend to be fairly forgiving of British politicians in 1792 and 1793. It's hard to wrap your mind around the idea that international politics has irrevocably changed, and the French Revolution is one of those rare moments in history when it clearly did. After the German poet Goethe witnessed the French Revolutionary Army's shocking victory over the better-equipped Royalist and Prussian army at Valmy, he wrote, "From this day forth begins a new era in the history of the world." Because such moments are rare, it's pretty arrogant to assume that you're living through one of them. But at the same time, there were plenty of signs that they needed to reconsider their assumptions about their enemy's war aims. Number 1 on that list would be the execution of Louis XVI in January of 1793. This was not an enemy likely to compromise at the negotiating table or likely to have much interest in exchanging colonies. The events of the Terror in 1793 should only have reinforced that conclusion. Now, it's important to concede that attacking the West Indies was not totally crazy, even while the Terror raged. If you assume, as Pitt, Grenville, and Dundas did, that the West Indies were vital to France's economy, then cutting France off from those colonies clearly had some strategic value. But in that case, as Mike Duffy argued a few decades ago, they needed to stick to their guns. The West Indies expedition should have taken precedence over all else, or gotten the men and equipment it needed and sailed on time. Weakening it for long shot opportunities in France was pointless. Also, they should have worked harder in 1794 to prevent reinforcements sailing from France to the West Indies. After all, that was one of the reasons to concentrate such force in the Channel Fleet. In the end, I come down on the side that argues that watching what was happening in France should have caused Dundas to reconsider the point of the West Indies expedition altogether. Perhaps he and Pitt could have entered the war with a little less hubris. Given that their enemy was clearly, as Auckland put it, in a state of internal and general frenzy, it might make sense to adopt a blockade and sea approach, constrict French sea power to European waters or even to port, and then send the disposal force to the best available opportunity. But that would have required a reconsideration of their war aims, and as we've seen, they were not able to do that in 1793. The result was that the strategy they adopted, of half measures and all, was never likely to succeed. They assumed that chaos in France meant weakness in France, and as a result, they threw away many of the advantages they'd spent the last decade building up. So the British did a lot right policy-wise in the 1780s in preparing for war, but while peacetime investments provided a platform for success, they were not themselves sufficient. They needed to be paired with a good understanding of the enemy's war aims, the ways in which that understanding would shape their own war aims, and how that shaped the deployment of force. In that case, the question that Pitt, Dundas, and Grenville should have asked themselves was, how might the enemy's ideological underpinnings cause them to behave, and does that suggest that our best approach is to stick to a pre-war strategy or adjust based on new information? Both approaches might have worked, but the middle path did not. So that's what I had to say in my chapter. I hope you found some of that interesting. Historiographically, my chapter engages with several recent efforts aimed at calling attention to Britain's failure in the French Revolutionary Wars. So James Davies' recent book focuses on the role of revolutionary ideology in the Royal Navy. Nate Jarrett's book highlights British diplomatic missteps. Josh Meeks' book focuses on the French Republican victories in the Western Mediterranean. And Casey Baker spends a lot of time on the coastal military campaigns and blames the Royal Navy for most of what went wrong. What I tried to do was take some of that new scholarship, blend it with an oral historiography on the West Indies expeditions, add in a little more naval strategy, and suggest some hopefully novel conclusions. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, my primary motivation was not historiographical, because Paul and I didn't design this conference or this book with that in mind. We had practitioners in mind, with all that entails for the construction of historical cases and arguments. So please keep that in mind as you consider pre-ordering it. I don't mean to dissuade you, of course. I mean to clarify what it is we were trying to do. The point of the book is to acknowledge something that the great Yogi Berra may or may not have said, which is that predictions are hard, especially about the future. Obviously, we don't have the answers, and Paul did not attempt his usual prognostications about the looming threat from Japan or whatever, But we do think our book raises a series of questions that planners today ought to consider. How confident are you that you correctly identified the enemy in the next war? Do you have a good understanding of your enemy's war aims? What assumptions are you making about how the enemy will behave, and how will you respond if the enemy surprises you? There are many others, ranging from the tactical to the grand strategic, and I encourage you to pre-order the book to uncover them. It's not always the case that Navy's best laid plans go awry, but it often is, as it was for Burns's wee little mouse, and we would do well to understand the reasons why. Thanks. Happy to take questions if you have any. Uh-oh. Yes, Ryan.
I was going to defer. So could you talk a little bit about how British strategy formulation, such as it was, actually worked? And how, after having such a successful time in the early years of in 55, 56, 57, why they didn't view that as a guidance for the way forward in 93?
Okay, I'm going to come back to the second one in a second. Let me start with the formulation of it. So one of the problems that they have is that Dundas holds 4 full-time jobs. He is Home Secretary, he's Treasurer of the Navy, he's a Member of Parliament in charge of a large patronage network, and one other that I'm forgetting. But anyway, so he's way overstretched. And one of the reasons why British strategy, I think, gets muddled in 1793 is that Dundas can't keep track of which balls he has in the air. But it's a small group of men meeting in an office that is basically where they're formulating British strategy. And that meeting in November is basically the 3 of them just batting around ideas and trying to figure out what to do. So that's how I understand the strategy to have been made. But they don't talk, for example, to the Duke of Richmond, who's in charge of the Ordnance Board, who's supposed to be providing all the guns and the ammunition for the expedition, until 2 months after the expedition was supposed to have sailed. And Richmond is busy saying, like, what do you mean, what expedition? I've never heard about any of this. So there are some problems internally in the British government about how they're communicating across different parts of it that would have enabled them to formulate a more coherent strategy and enact it in a more timely fashion. So that's one of the problems I think that they've got. In terms of what they're looking at back in the 7 Years' War, I think I'm not sure if they're looking at 55, 56, 57.
54, 55, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that they clearly recognized that the idea of letting the French escape from the American War, escape French waters in the American War is a problem, and that's why they bolster the Channel and the Mediterranean fleets and then sort of have this spare left over. But the other problem is that the French Navy is not in a position to be doing what they did in the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and they're looking at the French Navy and assessing it as not particularly competent. Because all the officers are members of the nobility, and the nobility is being guillotined, so the officers all flee, and so the turnover in the French Navy is such that they are not identifying them as a strong threat. But I do think that they're looking back to Pitt's father and saying, why don't we just at least try to keep him there, and then we can deploy forces to the colonies. But I'm not sure if I've answered all the questions there, but yeah. I don't know, that they're not specifically referencing every expedition from the 7 Years' War, but I think they're thinking broadly in those terms.
Yeah, fascinating discussion. I have a question about, you mentioned something in the Vendée and then Toulon, and then I guess the West Indies, which is mostly Martinique and Guadeloupe. Was there any, I mean, these counter-revolutionaries or whoever they were, was there any coordination between them? Are these totally separate worlds of, it's also jumbled to begin with, but is there anyone, and I'm sure the British naval planners were like, how the hell do we deal with these three totally different scenarios? And
right.
Maybe unpack that a little bit.
Okay, so they think they know what to expect in Martinique and Guadeloupe because they've been sending expeditions to the West Indies all the time.
The West Indies.
Yeah, so you go capture an island, that's what you do. What they don't realize is that then if a French official shows up and declares the abolition of slavery, that completely changes everything in the West Indies and overturns the entire social order, and they are not prepared for that at all. And so coordinating with counter-revolutionaries and plantation owners and all the different people in the West Indies is a total mess, and they basically get overwhelmed by diseases and the abolition of slavery. That's what does them in down there. At Toulon, they not only have to deal with the royalists who are in Toulon who are offering them the fleet, they have to deal with their Spanish allies who actually have more forces in the city, but the admiral in charge insists on being in charge and ignoring the Spanish. So they've got a triangular problem there where it's not just the royalists and not just the British.
The Allies are a worse problem than the
Correct. So they've got a different, totally different problem in Toulon. And then in the Vendée, they're trying to figure out what are these people and how do we coordinate with them. And they're operating on two different, you see they move from two different coasts, so the Navy has to know where to go. There's some suggestion that the rebels in the Vendée attacked Nantes because they thought that would be a port that the British could then use to resupply them with, even though David Bell has argued, I think, that the road to Paris was open. Like if they decided instead of going south, just march on Paris, I mean, who knows? But instead they decide, let's go meet the British on the coast, and the British are not prepared to handle these peasant rebels in the Vendée who are... Right, so there are different coordination problems in every theater, which is another reason why I think they just get overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. You're welcome.
To bring it closer to today, how are you incorporating this, if you are, into PME, and how are the students up at Newport responding to this type of material with, you know, the flavor of the day of who's the biggest enemy on the next one on the block for us, and how are they responding to this type of material?
I'll let you know next year. Okay. This is the first time I've ever talked about the book, so okay. But I'll more to come on that. I think we've got an event scheduled in March that should give us a sense of the kinds of questions. But about a third, 40% of the contributors are from the Naval War College, so there's a big Naval War College PME component to it. And so I think their chapters often, they are infected by PME brain. They all think in these terms, and so they're constructing their questions and their cases all on those lines. I don't know that I have a clear sense yet of how they'll respond to the kind of questions we're asking. I know that the provost at the War College scared me when he said, we should have you and Paul Kennedy talk with like some very high level planner in the Pentagon about planning and how that process works. And I was like, I don't want to do that, but if he insists, I guess we'll do it, and I'll let Paul answer all the questions. But yeah, so there's some talk about how to make this directly relevant, but I'm not sure yet exactly what path it will take.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about in the presentation was just that the British actually lose the naval arms race of the 1780s on the count of how many ships do the French and Spanish build. So if you look back at this thing here, in 1785, between 1785 and 1790, if you combine the French and Spanish fleets, they're actually bigger than the British. And that's exactly what had happened in the American War when the combined fleet of France and Spain sails up the English Channel in 1779. So they lose that. The difference is that it costs the French so much to build all these ships that it's one of the precipitating causes of Louis XVI calling the Estates General, which causes the French Revolution. Now, it's not that the French Navy caused the French Revolution, but it is among the different things that they're spending more money than they have on, it is the naval arms race of the 1780s. So what the British are able to do is basically sustainably build a fleet over time, and that's where I think their economic might really comes in. So they managed to translate sustained economic growth over time to eventually win the wars 22 years later. And that's not my idea of necessarily a successful outcome. If something like, I think the line right now is that the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars killed the same percentage of Europeans as the First World War did. It just took a lot longer, but it's a terribly bloody conflict that lasts that long. So the British definitely have stronger economic might. The French and Spanish are able to build ships quickly, but then they can't sustain it. The Spanish Navy basically collapses in the second half of the wars after Trafalgar.
So it was really, if you summarize the failure,
Yep. I think that they failed to understand what the French Revolution had done to France, which is a hard thing to have done in the moment. I think that's, this idea that it could unlock all these forces that they did not understand, that's a very difficult thing to do. Yeah, cultural forces, the levée en masse and the associated sort of levees that mobilized French manpower. Another thing I didn't mention is that the first naval battle of the wars, the proper fleet battle in 1794 at the glorious 1st of June, the British, again, they think the French Navy doesn't know what it's doing, and they score a tactical victory and I think they capture or sink 6 French ships, congratulations, but the grain convoy that the French Navy had sailed out to go escort gets through and saves the revolution. So there's a bunch of missteps where the British don't really understand what it is that they need to be doing to actually fight this new kind of enemy in 93 and 94. And I have a lot of patience for that. I think that's a really difficult thing to have understood. But there were signs, and people told them as much. So that's where I come down. Yeah.
We have time for about 5 more minutes. Any more questions?
Thanks very much.